Salute. How y'all doing? My name is DerrickWilliams. Shout out and respect due to my newest subscriber, Miss Kristen Maho. Bless your heart and thank you for subscribing. And a programming note, I will be going live later on today at about 4:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the title of that presentation will be called A Quick Live About Sex. And as y'all know, I'm just one man in the comment section on YouTube. The title of this presentation will be called Lobotomized Mississippi Black Children. I want to introduce you to Dr. Peter Breggin. He gave an interview to TruthStream Media. Now, as many of you all know, I love me some Cash Me Out. I Am Queen Supreme. It don't get no more thorough with regards to research and information than Queen Supreme. But I also pay homage to Mrs. Melissa Dykes of TruthStream Media based out in Texas, and a very great documentary is called The Minds of Men. Well, Dr. Breggin was featured in this documentary, and I told Queen's Throne a few months ago I heard of a doctor that debated a gentleman from the University of Mississippi that was actually lobotomizing black children. In other words, he was putting holes in little black children's heads and having electrodes protruding from the skulls of these children. Absolute monster this man is. His name is O.J. Andy, and I'm going to do more vetting on Mr. Andy, a monster in my opinion. So I'm going to say that again. Medical experimentation was done on children in my home state of Mississippi, where they burned holes in black children's heads. And as you can imagine, I'm a little passionate about that because I love my home state. But the fact is that my state has been an experimenting haven for a lot of different techniques and stuff that are going on today. This is actual factual, and it angers me. And here we are, black people fighting and killing every night, while you have people in suits that are experimenting on us every day as well. Something to think about. So all y'all take care. Greenville, Mississippi till I die.
I did not expect to be a reformer in psychiatry. I did not expect, in particular, to be the first physician to ever come out publicly opposed to lobotomy and psychosurgery and to take a public stand about it. I realized that psychiatry was going in a very bad direction. I went into private practice and I expected to write novels, maybe books about psychology, and to help people being a therapist. And one day I was sitting, just looking through my mail. I was just sitting there reading newspapers, and I opened up a psychiatric newspaper, and in it I found an announcement of the Second International Conference of Psychosurgeons. The first one had occurred decades earlier at the height of psychosurgery. I couldn't believe it. They were meeting in Copenhagen, and they were giving an honorary degree of some sort of honorific prize to Walter Freeman, who had lobotomized 5,000 Americans during the Great Wave in North America that really took the brains of about 50,000 people. Never opposed by anybody significantly in the medical field. And it named names of people who were doing various kinds of surgery, and it looked to me like at least one of these people was operating on children. Well, I'd only been out of my residency a couple of years, and I was not known as a big critic of psychiatry. I'd written a novel that was very critical of psychiatry, but nobody read the novel. And so I sent out requests to every single conference attendee that I could find. I finally got the agenda of the conference, and I asked them all who else did they know who was doing psychosurgery. I told them I was a young researcher at the Washington School of Psychiatry, where I have my office. And what came in freaked me out. I could not believe the stuff these people were sending to me. At this point, there was nothing obviously political. That would come in a second avalanche of grasping what was going on. At first, there was nothing going on that was political that I could see. That would come later in a kind of a second avalanche of information. What I found that most upset me was that at the University of Mississippi in Jackson, a surgeon named O.J. Handy was operating on little children as young as age 3, 4, and 5 for hyperactivity, aggressivity, difficult behavior, without even pretending to have psychiatric diagnoses or serious disorders. These were institutionalized children. O.J. Handy was inserting multiple electrodes into various portions of these children's brains. He was stimulating them, and then he was burning holes in their heads with the electrodes by heating them up. And he was then studying the children who walked around on the ward with wires dangling out of their heads. You can imagine what all this was doing to children. I contacted a lawyer in Mississippi who was working for some sort of a freedom project, and I told him about the institution that it was going on in, and I said, O.J. Handy never identifies the race of his children. That's very unusual in medical literature. I want you to go in there and find out the race of the children. He said, I don't have to go in there, sir. It's a segregated institution. This still gives me chills. I remember waking up at night, imagining I was a little black child and smelling my brain burning. That research by O.J. Handy, more than anything, made me realize I was not going to stop. I was just not going to stop about this. I just made up my mind. I had no idea what I was getting into. But the best news, probably most encouraging news I ever got in the campaign, so I called the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Mississippi, and he said to me, O.J. Handy, I know O.J., he's down the hall from me, his office is. I said, did you know he was putting electrodes into the brains of little children? He said, oh God, no, I did not know that. It was the only genuine expression of horror I ever got, I believe, from anybody in establishment medicine or psychiatry. He said, I'm going to look into this. Meanwhile, I was hammering O.J. Handy and embarrassing the University of Mississippi every chance I could get, radio, TV. In those days, before the pharmaceutical companies were advertising on radio and TV, I had much more access to major media, even though I was relatively unknown. Before I was done, I talked about this on just about every kind of major TV show there was. Daytime TV, CBS, ABC News, and so on. They set up a committee at the University of Mississippi to require a scientific protocol for O.J. Handy, and he was the first project I stopped. He never submitted anything there. I got to debate O.J. Handy on 2 occasions, one at the National Institute of Mental Health at their giant hall. I dismembered him. It was not hard. For example, he claimed that one of the little boys who I was following through his literature and whom I discovered had a declining IQ, literally, over the years, majorly declining. And I brought it up to him in front of the audience, and his answer was, well, I've written his IQ hasn't changed because he still has the same IQ of a 3-year-old. The level of evil was very difficult for me to handle, but after this, it should have been a historical moment. The science writers of the Washington Post covered the debate by me and O.J. Handy, which was inspired by my work and they covered it as a speech by O.J. Andy, which they much admired. It wasn't even a debate. I was somehow threatening the heart of the science writers, the science community. I had no idea that there were all these relationships going on, that what was most dear to the heart of a science writer was sucking up to the most important, innovative, so-called physicians and scientists. I might not have ever even had any kind of a movement get started, but became an international movement because I couldn't get any science writers interested. I couldn't get anybody to cover it. Then I read one day about a congressman who had held hearings on ADHD, 1972. So I called his office. I spoke to his chief assistant, his actual major assistant, who was very interested. I said to him, I have 100-page paper that I can't get a publisher to consider. I can't get journals to think about a piece of it. In fact, I called the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, asked him if I could do an article on psychosurgery, and he said, what are you talking about? He said, what are you talking about? Jose Delgado's a dear friend of mine. You'll learn more about Jose Delgado on this film, I'm sure. So I was getting nowhere, and the assistant to the congressman went to the National Library of Medicine and looked up my references to make sure I was being accurate in all my quotes, because it's 100 pages, mostly quotes. And he found that I was telling the truth, and he had the congressman publish this in the Congressional Record. So at least now it was printed. And I had a printed documents at U.S. Congress on top of it with a laudatory introduction. I thought that's the end of it. I don't know what to do now. And then somehow it occurred to me, what about the Associated Press? See, I had no experience. I didn't know anything about media or doing radio or TV in the beginning. I was actually a therapist who was writing novels and an occasional paper on things like the ethics of psychotherapy for good journals. I called the Associated Press, and here is the divine hand at work. The man who answered the phone at the AP said, I'm sorry, sir, the science writer's on vacation. He said, what is it you're interested in? I said, well, do you get the Congressional Record? He said, yes, sir, that's the clacking in the background. We get all that stuff just teletyped into us. I said, would you look up an article I just put in? He did. He read it. He called me back. He said, this is awful. The science writer, from my experience, would have actually squashed the story. He was appalled. He said, sir, if you will help me with the spelling and give me a little guidance, we're going to send out a 500-word press release throughout the world today. And he did. And that fortuitous, if it's fortuitous event, that the science writer was on vacation, started the anti-psychosurgery campaign. What I had not imagined early on was all of this might have political implications. It didn't dawn on me. I'm embarrassed at how naive I was about life. I had no idea the treachery of outstanding people in the field of medicine, psychiatry, neurology, neurosurgery. But I discovered a book called Violence and the Brain, and it was written by two Boston professionals. William Sweet wrote the introduction. He was arguably the most powerful physician in the country. He was the head of neurosurgery at the Mass General. Actually, getting to know these neurosurgeons taught me a new phrase. You don't have to be a neurosurgeon to be a neurosurgeon. This is an expression. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to some other activity to show you don't need high intelligence to do it. Well, the irony is you don't have to be a brain surgeon to be a neurosurgeon. All you have to do is be a butcher with a scalpel or a hot electrode or a poison you want to put in the brain. And then you put it in where you like to put it. The surgeon likes to do it to a different part of the brain. Sort of like somebody who specializes in an uppercut, and that's what you got to look out for. Somebody else punches you in the stomach, and somebody else rabbit punches you. Each neurosurgeon has a different part of the brain they like to hit. And then they develop a theory around it. So now we're looking at violence in the brain. Vernon Mark, neurosurgeon at Boston City. Frank Irvin, psychiatrist at Harvard. William Sweet, this powerful neurosurgeon during the introduction. And I read the book. And the book is about a man at the time called Thomas R. Thomas was a brilliant engineer with patents who was terribly violent and who, after the surgery, was now completely cured without any symptoms. And the surgery consisted of putting multiple electrodes in his brain, stimulating him, even stimulating him while he walked around the ward, then burning out parts of his brain. Well, I knew this was a lie. I didn't realize how huge it was going to turn out to be. So I began to get a hold of every single thing I could find that they had written. And I was able to put together that at the point they wrote in Violence in the Brain that he'd been cured forever, he'd been just discharged from the hospital. It wasn't a follow-up at all. It was something they were saying he was in the hospital. Then I found a very obscure article by these men, maybe so obscure they didn't expect anybody would find it, and it said that he'd become psychotic while they were stimulating him. And it described how he was saying, I don't want this anymore, I don't want this anymore. And then he became peaceful and accepted the treatment after they stimulated him enough. This is key, folks. Passivity, docility, obedience is key to this entire process. And now I found myself looking at what looked like one of the worst, most egregious, involuntary, brutal experiments ever reported in the medical literature, and nobody but me that I could find anywhere seemed to be bothered by it. So I wrote this up. And then I got a phone call or a letter, don't remember now, and it said, Dr. Breggin, I don't think you know what these men have been saying. Have you seen their letter to the Alabama where they talk about linking this to ghetto riots and curing ghetto rioters? And he sent it to me. Then began the avalanche. I really learned to do research, not just the research in books and articles. Before I was done, I found out that William Sweet had actually talked to the New York State legislature trying to get funding, describing how this surgery of stimulating brains and melting holes in the heads of people might be a cure for ghetto violence, because surely the leaders of the violence were abnormal and had abnormal brains that could be fixed with psychosurgery. Then I found out that the New York Times had done a positive review of this. Then I found, of course, the JAMA article where they talked about it at length, explaining how ghetto rioters must have abnormal brains because not everybody was rioting. So clearly, the people who weren't rioting had normal brains, and the few who were leaders. We're talking now about men you could name like Rap Brown and others who were trying to organize the black community. We're talking about some men, I'm sure, who were very frightening, and we're talking about some other men who were outraged at the conditions of life in which the children were growing up in these ghettos and were very politically and ideologically motivated whether you agreed with them or not. These men were, from the perspective of many in the black community, the only hope. They were heroes. And the idea that a leader must be the crazy one because you don't agree with them ideologically or because you're afraid of them doesn't make any medical sense. Wow, these guys went to Congress. They got a direct science grant from Congress. Congress doesn't give grants for scientific research. They came up with $500,000. They gave it to NIMH, completely bypassed all the review processes of NIH, and said, you give it to Mark, Irvin, and Sweet for their research.